Marcus checked his watch. 6:45 p.m. The hum of the industrial floor buffer was the only sound in the cavernous lobby of the Sterling Thorn Tower, a cathedral of glass and steel that scraped the Brooklyn sky. Outside, the December air was sharp and unforgiving, but in here, the atmosphere was thick with the ghosts of the day's ambition and the faint, cloying scent of expensive perfume and spilled champagne from the office party upstairs. He pushed the buffer in long, even arcs, his reflection gliding across the polished marble like a phantom. This was his world, silent, orderly, and invisible. He preferred it that way. Invisibility was a form of armor. He checked his watch again. 6:46 p.m. In exactly 44 minutes, the curtain would rise on the PS 321 winter pageant. His daughter Zara was playing the star catcher. It wasn't the lead role, but to Zara, it was everything. She had practiced her one line for weeks, her voice ringing through their small apartment with a seriousness that made his heart ache. "I'll catch the light, so the world is never dark." She'd say it with her small hands held up, her 10-year-old face a mask of pure conviction. He had promised her he'd be in the front row. A promise was a sacred thing between them, a bridge back to the bedrock of their life before it had fractured. Before Angela. The memory of his late wife came to him then, as it often did in these quiet, lonely hours. He could almost hear her voice, warm and teasing, over the drone of the machine. "You worry too much, Marcus. Just be there. That's all that matters." It was her wisdom, simple and profound, that had been his compass for the 3 years since the illness had stolen her from them. Be there. It was the core principle of his fatherhood. He was always there for school pickup, always there for homework, always there to braid her hair, the coarse, beautiful curls a living testament to the woman he had loved. Always there. The elevator chimed, a silver bell in the silence, and his body tensed automatically. It was a reflex honed by years of navigating a world that often saw his skin color before it saw his humanity. A black man, alone, late at night, in a corporate building. He made himself smaller, angling the buffer away from the elevator doors, keeping his eyes downcast. A janitor was a fixture, part of the background, unseen, safe. The doors slid open, and a woman stumbled out. He recognized her instantly. Elizabeth Sterling, the CEO, the Sterling in Sterling Thorn. She was usually a vision of controlled power, striding through the lobby in sharp suits, her phone pressed to her ear like an extension of her own mind. Tonight, she was a ruin. Her silk blouse was stained with wine, her exquisitely tailored skirt was twisted, and one of her ridiculously expensive heels was missing, clutched in her hand like a weapon. Her face, usually a mask of cool authority, was blotchy and streaked with mascara. She swayed on her one remaining heel, her eyes unfocused. Marcus froze. This was a complication he did not need. His entire life was a carefully constructed fortress against complications. He kept his head down, focusing on the whorls in the marble, hoping she would just pass by. He could hear her ragged breathing. She took a few unsteady steps toward the revolving doors, then stopped, leaning against a marble pillar for support. She fumbled in her purse, her movements clumsy and uncoordinated. Her phone slipped from her grasp and clattered onto the floor. He waited. 1 second, 2. She didn't move to pick it up. She just stood there, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. He could feel the seconds ticking away, each one a grain of sand slipping through the hourglass that separated him from his daughter's play. He could walk away. It wasn't his problem. His job was to clean the floors, lock up, and go home. That was the smart thing to do, the safe thing to do. But then he saw her reflection in the polished floor. She looked small, lost, not like a CEO, but like a woman whose world had just been shattered. He saw the kind of deep, foundational sadness that he recognized from the mirror. It was the look of someone who had just realized they were utterly alone. Angela's voice echoed in his mind again. Everyone deserves a hand up, Marcus. Everyone. With a sigh that felt like it was dredged up from the soles of his feet, he switched off the buffer. The silence that descended was heavy, absolute. He walked over and picked up her phone. The screen was cracked. He held it out to her. "Mom?" Elizabeth Sterling looked at him, and for the first time, he felt like she was actually seeing him. Not a janitor, not a uniform, but a person. Her eyes, a startling blue, were swimming with confusion and grief. She started, her voice a raw whisper. He left. He took everything. She wasn't speaking to him, not really. She was speaking to the empty lobby, to the empty space where her life used to be. "I'm sorry to hear that, Mom," Marcus said, his voice quiet and even. His tone was a carefully calibrated instrument, respectful, deferential, and entirely non-threatening. "Do you need me to call a car for you?" She shook her head, a gesture that almost sent her toppling over. "No car, no one. The accounts are frozen, all of them." She let out a laugh that was more like a sob. "The great Elizabeth Sterling can't even pay for a taxi." Marcus glanced at the clock on the wall. 7:05 p.m. The pre-show announcements would be starting. Zara would be backstage, her heart thumping with nervous excitement, scanning the assembling crowd for his face. He felt a spike of panic, cold and sharp. "Ma'am, you can't stay here. Let me help you." He tried to call a rideshare on his own app. Surge pricing. Fine. He confirmed it. 5 minutes later, the driver cancelled. Another one cancelled. It was the tail end of the city's holiday party rush. No one was available. He tried a traditional cab company. The dispatcher laughed. "An hour, maybe, if you're lucky." 7:15 p.m. The pageant would be starting. Zara's line was in the first scene. He pictured her small face, her big brown eyes searching the seats. The thought was a physical blow. He had never broken a promise to her, not once. It was the central pillar of their world. He looked at Elizabeth Sterling, who was now sliding down the pillar, her fight gone, leaving only a fragile, broken woman in its place. He looked at the revolving door, at the freedom of the cold street beyond, the street that would lead him to his daughter. He could just leave her, prop her up on a bench, tell security. But the night guard was a 70-year-old man who could barely stay awake, and leaving her this vulnerable felt like a profound moral failure. He thought of Angela, dying in a hospital bed, and how the kindness of strangers, a nurse who stayed late, a doctor who made an extra call, had been small lanterns in their darkest hours. He checked his watch. 7:19 p.m. He had 1 minute. He had to make a choice that would define who he was. Not just as a man, but as a father. Was a father the man who kept every promise, no matter what? Or was a father the man who showed his child, by example, what it meant to be a decent human being, even at great personal cost? He pulled out his phone and sent a text to his neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, his hands trembling slightly. "Emergency at work. Can you please record Zara's play? Tell her I love her, and I'm so sorry." He hit send, the word sorry feeling like a shard of glass in his throat. Then he turned to Elizabeth Sterling. He put all the authority he could muster into his voice, the quiet authority of a man who had navigated more than his share of crises. "Mom, Miss Sterling, I'm going to get you home." She looked up at him, her gaze hazy. "You?" "Yes, me." He took her arm gently. "My car is in the garage. It's not fancy, but it runs." He helped her to her feet, her weight surprisingly heavy. As he guided her toward the garage elevator, he caught his own reflection in the dark glass of the lobby doors. A black man, his arm around a disheveled, intoxicated white woman of immense power and wealth. Every alarm bell in his head, every instinct for self-preservation he had cultivated over a lifetime, was screaming at him. One wrong move, One misunderstanding could cost him his job, his reputation, his ability to provide for his child. There was no margin for error. He was walking into a minefield. But the next morning, when Elizabeth Sterling woke up in a strange house, wearing clothes that weren't hers, one phone call could change everything. For a black man, a single father, there was no room for misunderstanding. He was holding his breath, and he felt like he wouldn't be able to exhale for a very long time. The drive to her home was a surreal journey through a version of Brooklyn he only ever saw in magazines. They left his familiar world of brick-faced apartment buildings and bustling corner stores and entered a silent, tree-lined enclave of limestone mansions and gated gardens. His 10-year-old sedan felt like a trespasser on these hallowed streets. Elizabeth was slumped in the passenger seat, mumbling fragments of sentences about betrayal and contracts and a man named Richard. Marcus kept his eyes on the road, the GPS on his phone directing him to an address that seemed more like a coordinate for a different planet. He pulled up to a set of wrought iron gates taller than his car. "We're here, Mom." She fumbled in her purse again, her coordination still shot. "Opener, in here somewhere." She finally produced a small remote and pressed a button. The gate swung inward with a silent, imposing grace. He drove up a winding, heated driveway to a house that looked less like a home and more like a modern art museum. It was all sharp angles, dark wood, and vast panes of glass that revealed nothing of the inside. It was beautiful, impressive, and colder than the December night. Getting her out of the car and up the stone steps was an ordeal. She was a dead weight of despair, leaning on him heavily. He managed to get her key from her and open the massive front door. The interior was even more intimidating than the exterior. A cavernous, double-height living room was dominated by a cold marble fireplace. The furniture was sparse, architectural, and looked deeply uncomfortable. There were no photos on the walls, no clutter on the tables, no sign that people actually lived here. It was a showroom for a life, not the life itself. I need to lie down," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Okay, Mom, where is your bedroom?" She gestured vaguely up a floating glass staircase that looked like a death trap for someone in her condition. "Up there." Marcus took a deep breath. He could not, would not, carry her up that staircase and into her bedroom. The lines were already blurry enough. The risk was too great. "Is there a guest room on this floor? A sofa?" She shook her head, tears welling in her eyes again. He hated clutter. Everything clean lines. She gestured around the sterile space. "This was my compromise." He looked at her stained blouse and the dirt on her skirt from her earlier slide down the pillar. He couldn't in good conscience leave her to sleep in those clothes. But the alternative was unthinkable. His mind raced, searching for the least dangerous option in a sea of bad ones. He spotted a door off the main living area. "What's in there?" "Powder room," she mumbled. Another door. "And that one?" "Closet, linens or something." An idea born of desperation and a deep-seated need for self-preservation began to form. "Mom, I'm going to help you to the sofa. I want you to wait there for 1 minute. Don't move. Do you understand?" She nodded, her head lolling. He guided her to the long, low-slung white sofa and gently helped her sit. Then he went to the linen closet. Inside, he found stacks of neatly folded towels and, mercifully, a few sets of what looked like guest sweatsuits, plain, grey, unisex. He grabbed one. He also found a spare blanket and a pillow. He returned to the living room. "Mr. Sterling," he said, his voice firm but quiet, forcing her to focus. "I'm going to leave these clothes and a glass of water for you on the coffee table. The bathroom is just there." He pointed. "I'm going to go outside and wait in my car for 10 minutes. I need you to go into the bathroom, change into these clothes, and then come and lie down on the sofa. Can you do that for me?" It was a test. If she could manage that, she was coherent enough. If she couldn't, he'd have to call for an ambulance, another complication he dreaded. She stared at him, then at the sweatsuit, then at the bathroom door. A flicker of her usual sharp intelligence seemed to return to her eyes. She nodded slowly. Okay. He placed the clothes, a bottle of water from her pristine fridge, and 2 aspirin on the table. Then he walked out the front door, closing it softly behind him, and went back to his car. The cold air felt good, clearing his head. He sat in the driver's seat, the engine off, and watched the imposing facade of the house. The minutes crawled by. He pulled out his phone. A message from Mrs. Patterson. Got it, Marcus. She was a little star. Don't you worry about a thing. She's with me now having hot chocolate. She understands. Underneath was a blurry photo of Zara on stage, her arms raised, a halo of stage light around her head. A lump formed in his throat so large he could barely swallow. He had missed it. He had missed his little girl catching the light. He forced the feeling down. He had made his choice. Now he had to see it through. After what felt like an eternity, but was probably closer to 15 minutes, he got out of the car and walked back to the front door, his heart pounding a nervous rhythm against his ribs. He knocked softly. No answer. He knocked again, a little louder. Silence. A cold dread washed over him. He tried the handle. It was unlocked. He pushed the door open a crack. Miss Sterling. The house was silent. He stepped inside. The lights were still on. On the sofa, Elizabeth Sterling was curled up under the blanket he'd left out, fast asleep. She was wearing the grey sweatsuit. Her wine-stained clothes were in a heap on the floor by the bathroom door. He felt a small wave of relief. She was safe. Now what? He couldn't just leave. The front door was unlocked. Her house was a fortress, but a fortress with an open gate was just a target. He couldn't stay. The optics of that were a waking nightmare. He looked around the cold, impersonal room. He thought about his own small apartment, filled with Zara's drawings, the scent of the curry Mrs. Patterson had made for them last week, the worn spot on the sofa where he and Zara read together every night. This place wasn't a home. It was a gilded cage, and its owner was passed out and vulnerable. He couldn't leave her. He couldn't stay. The paradox was crushing him. He decided on a middle path, the only path that felt remotely defensible. He found a piece of paper and a pen in a drawer in the kitchen that was as sterile as a surgical suite. He wrote a note, his handwriting neat and clear. Mrs. Sterling, I brought you home as you were unwell. I have locked the front door from the inside. The spare key is under the mat for me to let myself out in the morning. I will be sleeping in the downstairs guest room to ensure your safety. Your car keys and personal effects are on the kitchen counter. Marcus King, maintenance. He hesitated. The guest room. That still felt too close, too intimate. He looked around again. There was a small alcove near the front door, almost like a miniature library, with a single armchair and a reading lamp. It was public, visible from the main living area, and undeniably separate. He amended the note. I will be in the reading chair by the front door. He placed the note on the coffee table next to the water bottle, where she would be sure to see it. He locked the front door, wedged the spare key under the edge of the large doormat, and then walked over to the armchair. It was leather and cold. He sat down. He didn't take his coat off. He just sat there, upright and alert, a sentry in a stranger's silent, lonely palace. He was a father who had missed his daughter's moment of triumph to sit guard over his wealthy boss. The absurdity of it was not lost on him. He leaned his head back and closed his eyes, listening for the sound of any danger, real or imagined. The only sound was the frantic beating of his own heart. Morning light, pale and grey, filtered through the massive windows, waking Marcus from a fitful, shallow sleep. His neck was stiff. His back ached from the unforgiving leather of the armchair. For a moment he was disoriented. the unfamiliar cavernous space confusing his senses. Then the reality of the situation crashed back down on him. He was in his boss's house. He had spent the night here. He sat bolt upright, every nerve ending firing with adrenaline. The house was still silent. He could see Elizabeth on the sofa, still asleep, her breathing deep and even. He needed to leave. Now, before she woke up. He needed to slip out as quietly as he had entered, a ghost in her life story. He stood up, his joints protesting, and moved silently toward the front door. He slid his hand under the mat, his fingers closing around the cold metal of the key. He had it. He was seconds from freedom. And then he heard a stirring from the sofa, a groan. He froze, his back to the living room, his hand on the doorknob. "Oh God, my head." Her voice was a raw croak, thick with sleep and dehydration. He didn't move. He didn't breathe. Maybe, just maybe, she wouldn't see him. She would see the note, piece it together, and he could disappear. He heard her sit up, the rustle of the blanket, a sharp intake of breath. What am I wearing? Marcus's blood ran cold. He remained perfectly still, a statue of a man about to be struck by lightning. He heard the fumbling sound of her picking up her phone from the table. He could imagine the scene from her perspective, waking up in her own home, but in strange clothes, with a pounding headache and a black hole where the last 12 hours of her memory should be. Her voice came through the silence, raw and terrified, as she spoke into the phone. "Claire, it's me. Something's happened." A pause. Marcus's heart hammered against his ribs. "I don't know, I woke up on my sofa. I'm wearing a sweatsuit, a grey sweatsuit. It's not mine, Claire, my clothes are on the floor." Her voice was rising in panic. "I don't remember anything after the party, after Richard called. I think someone is in the house." Marcus stood perfectly still, his back against the wall of the alcove. He knew how this would play out. He had seen this movie 100 times. He was the star of it, a black man, his drunk white boss, in her house. It didn't matter what actually happened. The story wrote itself, and it never had a happy ending for the guy who looked like him. He was trapped. If he spoke, he was the intruder she feared. If he ran, he was the guilty party, fleeing the scene. Every choice was the wrong one. "No, I haven't looked around," she was saying to her friend. "I'm scared. What if he's still here?" Another pause. Her voice dropped to a frantic whisper. "Call the police, Claire. Just call them. Tell them I think I've been assaulted." The word hit him like a physical blow, knocking the air from his lungs. Assaulted. The final, fatal piece of the narrative. The world tilted on its axis. He saw his life flashing before his eyes, not in a grand cinematic sweep, but in a series of devastating snapshots. The confusion on Zara's face as officers led him away. The cold, sterile interrogation room. The smirking disbelief of the detectives. The headline in the paper. The loss of his job. The fight for custody. The whispers in the neighborhood. Everything he had worked so hard to build. The small, safe world he had painstakingly constructed for his daughter was about to be burned to the ground because he had tried to do the right thing. He heard Elizabeth get up from the sofa. Her footsteps were hesitant as she moved around the coffee table. He heard the crinkle of paper. She had found his note. "Wait," she said into the phone, her voice different now, less panicked, more confused. "There's a note here." She read it aloud, her voice trembling. "Miss Sterling, I brought you home as you were unwell. I have locked the front door from the inside. I will be in the reading chair by the front door to ensure your safety. Marcus King, maintenance." A long silence. Marcus could hear the tinny, frantic voice of her friend Claire on the other end of the line. He could imagine what she was saying. "It's a trick. He's a predator. Don't believe him. The police are on their way." "Maintenance," Elizabeth said, her voice a mixture of bewilderment and dawning horror. She turned slowly, her eyes scanning the vast room, and finally, they landed on the alcove by the door. On him. Their eyes met across the gulf of the silent sunlit room. He saw fear in her face, yes, but also a sliver of something else. Doubt. He saw the gears turning in her mind, the polished analytical brain of a CEO trying to process conflicting data streams. The terrifying scenario her friend was painting versus the quiet, respectful words on the piece of paper. The heap of her own clothes on the floor versus the clean, sexless sweatsuit she was wearing. The story of a predator versus the image of a man in a maintenance uniform, standing frozen by her front door, looking more like a cornered animal than an attacker. He didn't say a word. He just held her gaze, his own face a blank mask that concealed the terror churning within him. He let the silence speak for him. He let the facts of the scene, the note, the blanket, the chair, the distance he had so carefully maintained, make his case. Elizabeth lowered the phone. "Claire, I need you to listen," she said, her voice steadier now, cutting through the frantic squawking on the other end. "Stop talking and listen to me." She took a deep breath, her eyes still locked on Marcus. "Nothing happened. He's here. The man who wrote the note." She took a step toward him, then another. Then, she was looking at him not as a threat, but as a puzzle. "Marcus King," she said, testing the name. "You work the night shift." He finally found his voice. It was hoarse. "Yes, Mom." "You brought me home?" "Yes, Mom." "You stayed here all night? In that chair?" "Yes, Mom." Her gaze dropped to his coat, to his tired posture, to the exhaustion etched on his face. She looked back at the note in her hand, then at the sweatsuit she was wearing. Something deep inside her expression shifted. The fear receded, replaced by a dawning, horrified understanding. Not fear of him, but fear of what she had almost done. She raised the phone back to her ear. Her voice was different now. It was the voice of Elizabeth Sterling, CEO, clear, decisive, and absolute. "Claire, cancel the call. I'm serious. Do it right now." She listened for a moment. "No, I am not in danger. I am perfectly safe. In fact," she said, her eyes finding Marcus's again, a complex emotion swirling in their blue depths, "I think this man may have just saved me, in more ways than one." She listened again, then her voice became iron. "I don't care what you think it looks like. I know what happened, and what didn't happen. He helped me when no one else would. He was a gentleman when he had every opportunity not to be. He has a daughter. He missed her school performance last night because he was making sure I didn't end up in a ditch or worse." Her eyes widened as that last piece of information, gleaned from his note and the context of the previous night, truly landed. He missed his daughter's play for me. She ended the call, tossing the phone onto the sofa as if it were contaminated. The silence that returned was different. It wasn't the silence of fear, but the heavy, ringing silence that follows a near catastrophe. Marcus felt the tension in his shoulders begin to ease, just slightly, just enough to breathe. The weight of the impending accusation, a crushing, suffocating thing, had been lifted. But the residue remained. The fear, the anger, the bitter knowledge of how close he had come to ruin. "I am so sorry," Elizabeth said, and the words were not a formality. They were freighted with a profound, gut-wrenching shame. "Mr. King, Marcus, I don't know what to say." "It's okay, Mom," he said, the words automatic, the conditioned response of a man used to smoothing over the discomfort of others. "No," she said, shaking her head fiercely. "It is not okay. It is the furthest thing from okay. What my friend, the assumptions we made." She ran a hand through her disheveled hair, looking around her own home as if seeing it for the first time. "You slept in that chair all night." "I couldn't leave the door unlocked," he said simply. "You could have left me on the side of the road," she countered, her voice raw. "You could have left me in the lobby. You missed your daughter's play. The repetition of that fact seemed to haunt her. What's her name? Zara, he said, the name a balm on his raw nerves. Zara, she repeated softly. And you missed her play to take care of me, a stranger who was a mess. He just nodded, too drained to speak. I will make this right, she said, the CEO in her reasserting itself, reaching for control, for a transactional solution. I will compensate you for your time, for the trouble. Marcus held up a hand, a gesture that surprised them both. The deference was gone, replaced by a quiet, unshakable dignity. That's not necessary, Mrs. Sterling. All I ask is that you remember this moment, that you remember that things aren't always what they seem. He turned and finally unlocked the front door. The click of the deadbolt was the sound of his release. He stepped out into the crisp morning air, pulling the door closed behind him. He didn't look back. He just walked down the heated driveway, past the iron gates, and got into his old sedan. He started the engine, the familiar rumble a comfort. He drove away from the silent mansion, away from the world of glass and steel and terrible misunderstandings. He drove toward home, toward Zara. As he drove, the adrenaline began to fade, and in its place, a deep, bone-weary exhaustion settled over him. And then, for the first time since he had switched off the floor buffer the night before, he allowed himself to feel the grief of his missed promise, the terror of the accusation, the hollow ache of his sacrifice. He pulled over to the side of the road, in a normal neighborhood with kids' bikes on the lawns, and he put his head on the steering wheel and wept. Before we continue with Marcus's story, let us know where you're watching from in the comments. We love seeing how far these stories travel. And if you enjoyed tales of integrity and unexpected connection, don't forget to subscribe for more. The drive home was a blur of traffic lights and storefronts. By the time Marcus pulled into his designated spot behind their modest apartment building, the storm of emotion had passed, leaving behind the quiet desolation of a beach after a hurricane. He felt scoured out, empty. He climbed the 3 flights of stairs, each step heavier than the last, his body protesting the night spent in the leather chair. He unlocked his front door and stepped inside. The apartment was warm and smelled of cinnamon and chocolate. Mrs. Patterson was sitting at their small kitchen table, a half-finished crossword puzzle in front of her. She looked up and gave him a warm, wrinkled smile that didn't quite reach her concerned eyes. There he is. I was starting to worry. Long night, he said, the understatement of the century. Zara's asleep, wore herself out being a superstar. She pushed a mug toward him. I kept some hot chocolate for you. He sank into the chair opposite her, wrapping his cold hands around the warmth of the mug. It felt like an anchor in a churning sea. Thank you, Martha, for everything, for being here. Nonsense, she said, waving a dismissive hand. That's what neighbors are for. That's what family is for. She peered at him over the top of her reading glasses. You look like you've been through the ringer, son. Everything all right at work? He took a sip of the hot chocolate. It was sweet and rich, a taste of childhood and safety. He couldn't bring himself to tell her the whole truth. How could he explain the abyss he had stared into that morning? How could he articulate the specific terror of being a black man in the wrong place at the wrong time, even when the place was exactly where his decency had led him? Just a complicated situation. It's handled now. Well, she said, sensing his reluctance to elaborate. Whatever it was, you're home now, and you have something you need to see. She nodded toward the small television in the living room. I'm not exactly Steven Spielberg, but I did my best. She had hooked up her small camcorder to the TV. Marcus walked over and sank onto the worn sofa. His sofa, the one that held the imprint of 1,000 bedtime stories. Mrs. Patterson pressed play. The screen flickered to life. The image was a bit shaky, the sound muffled by the ambient noise of a school auditorium. He saw the hand-painted backdrop of a night sky, the lopsided stars dangling from fishing line. He saw a procession of small children in charmingly clumsy costumes. Then he saw her, Zara. She was dressed in a shimmering blue tunic, with silver ribbons in her braided hair. She held a long pole with a net made of glittery fabric. She looked so small on the big stage, but she stood with a straight-backed seriousness that made her seem taller. He watched as the play unfolded, his heart aching with a mixture of pride and regret. He saw her listening intently for her cue, her brow furrowed in concentration. Then came her moment. The narrator, a nervous fifth grader, announced, and then, when all hope was lost, the star catcher appeared. Zara walked to the center of the stage. She held up her net. She took a deep breath, and then she said, her clear, high voice ringing through the auditorium, "I'll catch the light, so the world is never dark." He had missed it. He had missed seeing it live. The lump returned to his throat. He had broken his promise. But then, something unexpected happened. After a moment of applause, Zara didn't exit the stage. She held up her hand for silence, a gesture of startling confidence. The auditorium quieted. She looked directly at the spot in the audience where Mrs. Patterson was filming, as if she could see right through the lens to him. "And," she added, her voice soft but firm, "I want to add something. My daddy couldn't be here tonight. He had to help someone who was sad. My mommy, Angela, she used to say that helping someone is like catching a little piece of light too. So this light is for you, Daddy. I love you." She then swept her net through the air, as if gathering up all the light from the stage, and held it out toward the camera. The audience, after a moment of stunned silence, erupted in applause that was warmer and louder than before. On the screen, Marcus could see Zara's teacher, Miss Albright, wiping a tear from her eye. The video ended. The screen went blue. Marcus just sat there, the sound of that applause, of his daughter's voice, echoing in the silent apartment. The shame, the fear, the anger, all of it was washed away by a tidal wave of love, so pure and powerful it left him breathless. She wasn't disappointed. She wasn't mad. She understood. She had taken his failure and transformed it into an act of love and honor. She had seen the good in his broken promise. He didn't realize he was crying until Mrs. Patterson put a comforting hand on his shoulder. "That's some little girl you got there, Marcus." "Yeah," he whispered, wiping his face with the back of his hand. "Yeah, she is." He felt a profound sense of clarity. The events of the night had been terrifying. The risk had been immense. But Zara's words, her innocent and profound wisdom, had reframed everything. He hadn't chosen a stranger over his daughter. He had chosen to be the man his daughter already believed him to be. The man Angela would have wanted him to be. A man who catches the light, even when it's hard, even when it's dangerous. Later that day, after a few hours of deep, dreamless sleep, he was in the kitchen making Zara's favorite lunch, grilled cheese with the crusts cut off, when his phone buzzed. It was an unknown number, a Manhattan area code. He almost ignored it, but some instinct made him answer. "Hello." "Mr. King, Marcus, it's Elizabeth Sterling." Her voice was clear, sober, and laced with an unfamiliar humility. He stiffened slightly. "Miss Sterling. Please, call me Elizabeth. I hope I'm not disturbing you. I got your number from HR. I wanted to apologize again. Properly." "It's forgotten," he said, a lie, but a necessary one. "No," she insisted. "It won't be forgotten, not by me. What I wanted to ask is, would you be willing to meet with me? Sometime this week? I have a proposition for you, and I'd like to discuss it in person. It's not about money. It's about something else." He hesitated. Part of him wanted nothing more than to sever all ties with her and the terrifying world she represented. But another part, the part that had been touched by Zara's grace, was curious. and he recognized the tone in her voice. It wasn't the command of a CEO, it was the tentative request of someone trying to make amends. "Okay, Elizabeth," he said, surprised at how easily her first name came to him. "I can do that." A few days later, Marcus found himself back in the Stirlingthorne Tower, but this time he wasn't pushing a buffer. He was riding the express elevator to the penthouse floor, wearing his best trousers and a collared shirt. He felt out of place, a sparrow in an eagle's nest. But the terror from before had been replaced by a quiet sense of purpose. Elizabeth's office was as vast and minimalist as her home, but with one key difference. The entire back wall was a floor-to-ceiling window with a staggering godlike view of the city. She wasn't sitting behind her massive desk. She was standing by the window. And when she turned to greet him, she was not the imperious CEO or the broken woman from the party. She was someone new, subdued, thoughtful. "Marcus, thank you for coming." "Elizabeth." She gestured to two armchairs positioned to face the window, not the desk, a subtle but significant shift in power dynamics. "Please." They sat in silence for a moment, looking out at the sprawling metropolis below. "I've been doing a lot of thinking since that night," she began, her gaze fixed on the horizon, "about the assumptions I make, the bubble I live in. I called my friend Claire the next day. I told her the whole story. The part about you sleeping in the chair. The part about you missing your daughter's play." She was silent for a very long time. Then she said, "My God, Elizabeth, we almost ruined an innocent man's life." Marcus just nodded, his hands resting on his knees. "That night," she continued, turning to face him, "my husband of 15 years, my business partner, informed me via text message that he was leaving me for a younger woman and that he had initiated a hostile takeover of our company, freezing our joint assets in the process. My world fell apart in the space of about 30 seconds. Her voice was clinical, as if describing a case study. I did what I always do when I lose control. I drank. I made a spectacle of myself. And I ended up a helpless mess in the lobby of my own building." She paused, and her composure cracked just a little. "You were the only person who didn't look away. Everyone else, my colleagues, my so-called friends, they just melted away. They didn't want to get involved. But you, a man who had every reason to keep his head down and walk away, you stepped in. You sacrificed something precious, a memory with your daughter, for a stranger who the next morning nearly repaid you by destroying your life. You didn't know," he said quietly. "That's not an excuse," she said, her voice sharp with self-recrimination. "My ignorance, my privilege, it's not a shield. That morning, I saw the world through your eyes for about 30 seconds, and it was terrifying. The knowledge that your character, your integrity, your very freedom could be wiped out by one hysterical phone call from someone like me. I have never felt so ashamed." This was the real apology. Not the clumsy offer of money, but this raw, painful admission. He found himself wanting to ease her discomfort, but he stopped himself. This was something she needed to feel. This was how change happened. "I've been running this company for 10 years, she said, her voice regaining its steady, executive tone. "We have diversity initiatives. We have mentorship programs. We write checks to charities. And it's all meaningless. It's a performance. It's not real. Real is what you did. Real is the character you showed when no one was watching." She leaned forward, her eyes intense. "I am creating a new position at this company. Director of Community Engagement and Corporate Integrity. It's not a PR role. It's a senior management position with a real budget and real power to make changes, to build bridges between this tower and the communities we operate in, to ensure our corporate culture is built on a foundation of genuine respect, not just performative gestures." She took a breath. "I want you to be the one to run it." Marcus stared at her, speechless. He thought it was a joke. Him, a janitor, running a corporate department. Elizabeth, I appreciate the offer. I really do. But I'm not qualified. I have a high school diploma and a certificate in building maintenance. I clean floors. No, she said firmly. You build bridges. You understand dignity. You have more integrity in your little finger than my entire board of directors combined. You are the most qualified person I know. You won't be doing it alone. We'll build a team around you. You'll have consultants, staff, whatever you need. What I need, what this company needs, is your compass, your character. He was stunned. The offer was absurd. It was life-changing. It was terrifying. It was a way out of the invisibility he had curated for so long. It was a chance to be seen, to have a voice, to make a real difference, not just for him and Zara, but for others. I don't know what to say. Say you'll think about it, she said, a small smile touching her lips for the first time. And while you're thinking, I did some research. The community center in your neighborhood, the one Zara takes art classes at, its funding was just cut. I've made an anonymous donation through the new foundation I'm setting up. It's enough to keep them running for the next 5 years and to expand their programs. She held up a hand as he started to protest. It's not for you, Marcus. It's not a payment. It's a down payment. On me becoming a better person. On this company becoming a better citizen. You showed me what it means to catch the light. I'm just trying to reflect a little of it back. He looked out the window again, at the city spread out before him like a promise. For years, he had lived his life trying to be invisible, trying to avoid mistakes, trying to never give anyone a reason to question his character. But that night, he had made a different choice, a dangerous choice, and somehow, against all odds, it had led him here. Maybe the world wasn't fair. Maybe it never would be. But maybe, just maybe, there were still people who could see him for who he really was. People who were willing to change. Okay, he said, turning back to her. I'll think about it. But in his heart, he knew he had already made his decision. You don't get a chance to help build a better world and say no, not when you have a little girl at home who believes you catch the light for a living. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of change. Marcus accepted the position. The announcement sent a ripple of shock through the Sterling Thorn Tower. Some executives were skeptical, others patronizing. They saw a janitor being given a title, a token gesture from a CEO in crisis. They didn't understand that Elizabeth hadn't just given him a job, she had given him a platform and the power to use it. Marcus, for his part, was terrified and exhilarated in equal measure. He moved from the basement utility closet to a corner office on the 45th floor, not far from Elizabeth's own. The first few days, he felt like an imposter, the scent of floor polish still clinging to his imagination. He wore the new suits Elizabeth's assistant had helped him pick out, but they felt like a costume. He sat in on meetings where people used acronyms he didn't understand and discussed sums of money that were abstract and meaningless to him. He spent his evenings at the kitchen table with Zara, not with her homework, but with his. He read books on corporate social responsibility, on non-profit management, on urban development. Zara would sit beside him, doing her own reading, occasionally looking up to offer him a piece of advice. "Daddy, that man in the book looks grumpy. You shouldn't be grumpy at your new job." Or, "Does integrity mean you do the right thing even if your tummy feels nervous?" Out of the mouths of babes came the truths he was trying to navigate. His first real test came during a budget meeting for the new department. The chief financial officer, a man named Henderson who looked permanently skeptical, presented Marcus with a list of high-impact, low-cost initiatives. They were all superficial PR stunts, a photo op at a soup kitchen, sponsoring a 5K run, putting the Sterling Thorn logo on a new playground. It was the old way of doing things. Charity as advertising. Marcus looked at the proposal, his heart sinking. This was exactly the kind of performative nonsense Elizabeth had said she wanted to move away from. He could feel the eyes of the other executives on him. The new guy, the janitor. They were waiting for him to rubber stamp it, to be grateful for whatever scraps they threw his way. He thought of his years of invisibility, of how he had learned to nod and agree and disappear. But then he thought of Zara's voice in the auditorium. Helping someone is like catching a little piece of light. This proposal wasn't catching light. It was just making noise. He pushed the folder back across the polished table. "No," he said. The word fell into the silent room with the weight of a stone. Henderson raised an eyebrow. "No, Mr. King, this is a standard community outreach portfolio. It's designed for maximum brand visibility." "I'm not interested in brand visibility," Marcus said, his voice quiet but firm. He could feel his palms sweating, but he kept his gaze steady. "I'm interested in impact. I've spent my entire life in the communities you want to get brand visibility in. A photo op doesn't fix a leaking roof at the community center. A logo on a slide doesn't help a single mother who needs affordable after-school care so she can work a second job." He took a breath and leaned forward. "Our budget won't be spent on things that make us feel good. It will be spent on things that do good. We're going to partner with local leaders. We're going to fund programs that are already working but are under-resourced. We're going to invest in job training programs for at-risk youth and offer them internships right here, in this building. We're not going to write checks and walk away. We're going to show up, we're going to listen, and we're going to help, authentically." There was a stunned silence. He had expected to be shut down, laughed out of the room. Instead, Elizabeth, who had been sitting at the head of the table saying nothing, spoke. "Henderson," she said, her voice cool and clear, "give Mr. King the budget he requires, and from now on, all initiatives from his department are approved by me directly. Is that understood?" Henderson, flustered, simply nodded. In that moment, Marcus understood. Elizabeth hadn't just given him a title. She had given him her power of attorney. She was his shield, allowing him the space to do the work. He was no longer invisible. He was a force to be reckoned with. The relationship between Marcus and Elizabeth settled into a unique and powerful partnership. It was not romantic. It was something deeper, a bond forged in a moment of crisis and cemented by mutual respect. She relied on his moral clarity, his connection to a world she had never known. He relied on her strategic mind and her willingness to bulldoze corporate bureaucracy to get things done. They had lunch once a week, not in the executive dining room, but at a small, family-owned diner a few blocks from the tower. It was his choice. He wanted her to feel the city at street level. During one of these lunches, she talked about her divorce, the betrayal, the legal battles she was now fighting to regain control of her company. "He never saw me," she said, stirring her coffee. "Not really. He saw a partner, an asset, a symbol. When he found a newer, shinier symbol, he just traded up." "I'm sorry," Marcus said. She looked at him, a wry smile on her face. "You know, for a while, I thought I wanted to destroy him, ruin him the way he tried to ruin me. But then I watch what you're doing, building things, connecting people, and I realize that's the better revenge, not destruction, creation." He learned about her loneliness, about the gilded cage of her life. She learned about his. He told her about Angela, about their love story, about the lessons in grace and strength she had taught him. He spoke of his constant, low-grade fear for Zara, the need to be a perfect father, because the world offered so little grace to a man like him. "You're not just a perfect father," she told him, her voice soft. "You're a good man, Marcus King, and you shouldn't have to be perfect to be seen as good." The changes he implemented began to take root. The Sterling-Thorn Tower started to feel different. The lobby, once a cold, transient space, now featured a rotating exhibit of art from local schools, an idea that came directly from seeing Zara's drawings on his fridge. The internship program brought in a dozen kids from neighborhoods the company had only ever driven through. Marcus knew them all by name. He mentored them, checked in on them, saw the same spark of potential in them that he saw in his own daughter. One afternoon, Zara came to his office after school. Her eyes were wide as she took in the view. She spun around in his big leather chair, giggling. She looked at the plans and charts on his wall. "Are you catching a lot of light up here, Daddy?" He scooped her up in a hug, burying his face in her hair. "We're trying, sweetheart. We're trying." A few months later, PS 321 announced its spring concert. Zara had a solo, a whole song. She'd been practicing for weeks, her voice growing stronger and more confident. The concert was on a Thursday evening. Marcus blocked it out on his calendar. Nothing, absolutely nothing was going to make him miss it this time. On the day of the concert, a crisis erupted. A pipe had burst at the community center his department was now funding, flooding the main activity room and ruining hundreds of dollars worth of art supplies. The director of the center, a woman named Maria, called him in a panic. The insurance wouldn't cover it quickly, and they had a kids' art show scheduled for the weekend. The old Marcus would have seen this as someone else's problem to solve through the proper channels. But the new Marcus saw a community in need. He saw the heartbroken faces of the kids who would miss their art show. He spent the afternoon on the phone, calling contractors, arranging for emergency repairs, trying to find a solution. As the clock ticked toward 5 p.m., he realized he was cutting it close. The concert was at 6:30. He still had to get the funding approved for the emergency supplies. It required a sign-off from Henderson, who, despite Elizabeth's edict, still dragged his feet on every one of Marcus's requests. He found Henderson just as he was packing up to leave for the day. "I need your signature on this, Frank. It's an emergency." Henderson glanced at the form. "A burst pipe. That's a maintenance issue. It can wait until morning." "No, it can't," Marcus said, his patience wearing thin. "There are kids who have been working for months on this art show. Their families are coming. It's important." "Everything is an emergency with you, King," Henderson sneered. "It's just an art show." The condescension in his voice, the casual dismissal of something that meant the world to these children, struck a nerve. "It is not just an art show," Marcus said, his voice dropping low. "It's about promises. It's about showing these kids that their work matters, that they matter. A lesson some people in this building have yet to learn." He held Henderson's gaze, unblinking. The CFO, unaccustomed to being challenged so directly, flushed and snatched the form. He scribbled his signature and practically threw it back at Marcus. "Fine. Don't expect me to bail you out every time one of your pet projects has a problem." Marcus rushed the form to accounting, got the purchase order, and called Maria at the center to tell her the new supplies were on their way. When he finally looked at his watch, it was 6:15. The auditorium was a 30-minute drive in good traffic. He was going to be late. He might miss it again. The irony was crushing. This time, he was missing Zara's performance not to save a CEO, but to save a community art show. He raced to his car, his heart pounding with a familiar dread. He called Mrs. Patterson. "I'm running late. Can you save me a seat?" "Always, son. Drive safe." He hit traffic, of course, a fender bender on the BQE. He sat in his car, drumming his fingers on the steering wheel, his anxiety mounting. He was going to miss it. After everything, he was going to break his promise again. When he finally burst through the doors of the school auditorium, the concert was already in full swing. He scanned the crowded room, his eyes searching for an empty seat. He saw Mrs. Patterson waving from the third row, and sitting next to her, in the seat she had saved for him, was Elizabeth Sterling. She had seen the concert on his public calendar. She had seen the crisis with the community center unfold via email. She had guessed he would be late. So she had come, to save his seat, to be a placeholder, to be there for him, the way he had been there for her. He slid into the seat just as Ms. Albright walked to the microphone. "And now," the teacher announced, "for a special solo performance, please welcome Zara King." His little girl walked to the center of the stage. She was wearing a simple white dress. She looked out at the audience, found his face, and gave him a smile that lit up the entire room. The piano began to play a soft, simple melody. And then Zara began to sing. Her voice was clear and pure, full of a strength and confidence that he hadn't heard before. It was a song about finding your voice, about not being afraid to be seen. As she sang, Marcus felt Elizabeth reach over and gently squeeze his hand. It wasn't a romantic gesture. It was a gesture of solidarity, of friendship, of shared understanding. He looked at his daughter on the stage, bathed in light, her voice filling the room. He looked at the powerful woman sitting next to him, a woman who had become an unlikely friend, an ally. He thought of the journey he had been on, from the silent, invisible man in the lobby to the man in the front row, a man with a voice, a purpose, and a community. For years, Marcus had lived his life trying to be invisible, trying to avoid mistakes, trying to never give anyone a reason to question his character. But that night, he had made a different choice, a dangerous choice, and somehow, against all odds, it had led him here. Maybe the world wasn't fair, maybe it never would be, but maybe there were still people who could see him for who he really was, and maybe, just maybe, that was enough to change it. Marcus's story reminds us that character isn't built in the spotlight. It's built in the small choices when no one is watching. If this story moved you, hit that like button. Subscribe for more stories about real people facing real challenges with grace. And tell us in the comments, what would you have done in Marcus's situation?